Back last year, before all the quarantine, I was a little bit south of Kelton, which is northwest of Salt Lake City in Utah, and I saw a massive dog running around. I don't know if it was wild or what, but I've never heard of wild dogs out there, let alone ones this size. At first, when I got out of my truck, I thought this thing was a massive black lion, until I got a closer look and realized it looked very much like a dog. With the way it ran though, it was very much like a cheetah in the way that its back was arched. It kept its entire head very low to the ground and its ears back. I've never in my life seen a dog breed look exactly like that, or as large. It almost reminded me of my friend's jet black mastiff, who's massive. I saw it running off in the distance before finally disappearing behind some trees. It was my first time ever seeing a wild dog that big, until I asked a friend of mine who's an animal expert, and I asked him about wild dogs living in North America. She informed me that there is no such thing as a wild dog living in North America that fits the description that I gave her. She went on to educate me about wild dogs that are even in other parts of the world, like Africa, for example, none of which again have the same description that I gave her. So what exactly did I see that day? Even she herself wasn't sure, because nothing matches that description that is currently supposed to be living in the wild. Is it possible that I was witness to an undiscovered species of wild dog living in North America? Maybe it's not a wild dog at all, considering the only part that was remotely dog was its head. The rest of its body was different shaped, especially the way it arched its back, like I told you. Its limbs didn't even look correctly portioned the same way a dog's does. It had longer front legs and shorter back legs, and again, the back was arched different. It even looked different than a dog as it ran on all fours, and was faster as well. I guess the thought of an undiscovered species of wild dog out here is possible. It is pretty remote. Maybe I just stumbled upon something nature never intended for me to see. What are your thoughts and feelings on this? My sighting of a massive wolf dog creature eating a dead cow on the side of NM 36 happened south of Gallup, New Mexico, into the Zuni Reservation. It was in the early morning hours, and I was driving south. No other cars around me at the time. I was on my way to meet a client and seal a deal when I saw something on the side of the road that gave me nightmares, and still does. Partially laying in the road was a bull, a dead bull, being partially eaten on by this creature. The back half of this steer was lying in the middle of the road, or at least on the side, enough that to get around it, you had to swerve into the oncoming lane. I got a good look at the side profile of this thing eating on it. It looked like the perfect blend of a man and a coyote. A shorter snout, higher cheekbones, and the bones around the eyes looked very human. But the body was very man-like too, but it had hands that kind of resembled a raccoon. But they still did resemble more of paws, if I'm trying to be as accurate as possible. I couldn't tell if it had a tail or what the feet looked like, because the way it was hunched over eating. As I came up to the grisly scene, I slowed down and just stared at this thing eating the cow, and just slowly swerved around the scene, and then continued on. This thing never once even bothered to look up at me or my car going by. It either didn't know I was there, or was just choosing to ignore me while it feasted on its meal. From the scene that I witnessed, I can only imagine possibly that a loose steer got away, and this creature chased it and finally got it right as it crossed this road. That's my only guess as to why there was a steer laying halfway into the road and this thing eating on it. Had anybody else driven by, they would have seen the same thing. And no, I didn't bother to call the police or anybody to let them know. I just figured that in the moment, the scene would work itself out. Judging by how much of the steer was eaten, I would say it had been there for at least an hour or two, eating on a good amount of the meat. It wasn't freshly dead. Is it possible that the steer had gotten loose and was crossing the road when a semi hit it? Yes, but I didn't get a look at the steer's head. I only saw the backside, with its legs extended out on the ground. I can't give you any estimates to how big or tall this was, but if I'm being as accurate as I possibly can be, I will say it was at least as big and wide and tall as a man would, just with a coyote-looking face and head. I moved down here with my family to the southwestern region of the United States when I was just 13, so I've heard my fair share of weird stories all throughout the desert. But this was the first time I've ever seen something so out of the ordinary like this. I don't try to explain it, I don't try to apply logic or anything that a rational human being would do. I just accept it is what it is, and I try and move on with my life. In the back of my mind, I've always kind of believed this stuff happens, but I never wanted to fully accept it. I've even heard more stories that this kind of stuff is common on reservations. I don't know if there's any coincidence to this happening on the Zuni reservation, but I take it for what it is. Anyway, that's my sighting. Do with it whatever you will. There's all sorts of strange accounts and sightings that happen in the White River National Forest, home of the Ute people in Colorado. Stories date back hundreds of years ago of the Utes seeing these large, coyote-like creatures, half man, half coyote, seen to even been eating on white men traveling back in the day. Disturbing stories of even travelers being chased into the woods and devoured alive by these creatures. The Utes also fell victim to these same creatures, but not as often, because they knew the boundaries, they understood the proper barriers to stay away from these things, and they created the proper wards, the same way they would with any other creature, like a skinwalker, for example, or whatever Ute equivalent they had to that creature, since that seemed to be a mainly Navajo and Apache creature. A lot of the stories that I've acquired over the years occurred back in the 1800s and happened to white men, whether they were just traveling through the area, building civilization, or even just exploring. It was often that these would be attacked by groups of these creatures, drug off, and devoured alive. Their bones would be continuously gnawed on until they were turned to weapons or even dust. I do believe there was written documentation calling these things coyote men, but that is in the hands of the Smithsonians now, and who knows where that is. The reason that the majority of these things happened back in the 1800s was because that was when man was first traveling through the area. White men, I should say. They weren't familiar with the dangers, the sightings, the surroundings. It was all new territory for them to expand and grow. And all while my sect of Utes had very minimal conflict with the white man, we would try to give them warnings every time they came to the area, or so I was told from stories passed down. Unfortunately, many of them, families included, women, children, elderly, the sick, newborn babies, all fell victim and prey to these things, the coyote men, as they call them, said to be anywhere between 5 to 6 feet in height, a coyote head on a human body, very, very intelligent and very aggressive. These beings had a bloodthirst for human flesh, and it didn't take many victims for the Utes to soon discover that they need to stay out of certain areas and locations. These coyote men were vicious and relentless. They would even go as far as setting up traps for humans. There were even chiefs at the time, or daughters of chiefs, and some of my tribe's greatest warriors that fell to these creatures. At one point even, I want to say it was around 1820 or 1821, one of the smaller Ute villages was invaded and overturned by these creatures, killing everybody. In modern day times, this entire area is now known as the White River National Forest, and these things are crawling all throughout. My family and I don't live anywhere close to that forest, thank God, because I wouldn't want to put myself in danger, but my family is still heavily into the culture and traditions of the tribe, and they still tell me lots of stories. Even as a child, I was forbidden from entering certain parts of the woods that weren't even close to that national forest, in fear that these things have spread. Had I been a lone child wandering around without the safety of a parent, I would have for sure been snatched and taken, and probably eaten alive. Being an adult and understanding a little bit more about the history of America, and understanding settlers and how they traveled to the West Coast and the pioneers and all that, I would probably estimate that maybe 400 to 500 white men in total were chased, attacked, and eaten by these coyote men. It's a rough number, yes, but I'm probably under-exaggerating here. I'm trying to stress to you that many died to these things, which is why a lot of that forest at the time remained unexplored and uncharted, at least to the white men. The Utes had gone to war with these beings several times over the course of several years, losing many good soldiers, women, and children in the process, and only killing a handful of theirs. When I say they were bloodthirsty beasts, I'm not kidding about that. Very often, when I would hear these stories about them, the tribesmen would refer to them with the word they also are referred to as a demon. Nowadays, there are two possible options. One is that these things have receded dramatically and don't attack like they used to, or they have all but died off or retreated entirely from the area. The second is that people are continuing to be captured, eaten, die, go missing, what have you, all while the Forest Service and government keep everything quiet. And I'm not sure exactly which option it is. The rest of the Utes don't really talk about it or even acknowledge it like they used to, back in the day. So the age and tradition of my people is slowly dying out, and because of this, we have not been able to warn our people and others properly about the dangers that what we still believe lurks deep within the woods. And believe me, that when I say that these coyote men are not our only enemies, there are many other beings that also coincide, that also cause havoc and wreak destruction and seek to take over our people. In fact, it's many of the same beings you speak about in a lot of your stories online. My purpose in messaging you is to let you know that they are adamant about the destruction of humans. To start things off, I'm 17 and currently live with my dad. We have about 16 or 17 acres out where we are, with much of it my dad uses to hunt on during the season. Well, this last season, we had something interesting happen. My dad's a big-time hunter, and even goes as far as getting a doe tag for the extra meat. He's got a buddy who's a butcher, so he gets a lot of free jerky, steaks, back and leg straps, and more for him for virtually free. Anyway, my dad has a rather large shed or shop. It's older, and long before we moved here. It's like a large shed, the size of a shop that my dad installed lights in and other stuff to make it his shop for the time being. There's no concrete slab for the floor though. It's just dirt. Really fine packed down dirt. It's about a few 100 feet out if I really had to guess. During the season, he actually hangs, dresses, and harvests all the meat in his shop. Because of this, the shop usually reeks like blood and death during this time. That's pretty normal. One morning, my dad got up and he was going out to pull hunks of meat out of his big freezer in the shop. I hear him start yelling and shouting. I go running out there to see what the matter is, and to the back side of the shop, there was a massively dug hole that led directly underneath the shed or shop. When I say a massively dug hole, I mean a hole about 8 or so feet deep, probably close to 7 feet wide, all the way underneath the shop. It looked like a digging crew had came here and dug on the side of the shop underneath into it. The hole didn't look like it had been dug up by shovels, but rather big handfuls of some sort of large tool by the way the dirt looked. There was also a huge amount of dirt behind the hole on the outside, giving the impression it was like an animal dug its way underneath the shop. The only animals my dad and I know of that do this is dogs. Even if this ain't no dog, there's nothing that can dig an 8-foot hole directly underneath the shop. It was unsettling. My dad had to spend some hours filling the hole back up. Nothing inside of the shop seemed to be disturbed or moved in any way. I almost wonder if because my father just dressed a deer in there a day prior, that it could have possibly attracted a large predator. I mean, the shed isn't terribly big and smells so bad of death and blood. My dad didn't have any deer meat or parts lying around, but maybe a big cougar or something smelt it and tried to get in. I don't know. I can accept that some animal wanted it because of this, especially after my dad agreed with me, but we just can't come up with any animal that digs this big of a hole. Any ideas? I wanted to write this to you sooner, but my family and I have been busy quarantining and getting supplies ready to hunker down. Speaking of the matter, I hope you and all of your fans are staying safe as needed. on with what I saw. Back when life was a little more normal in early February, I was driving home from work. I do networking support for a rather small company, so I'm usually there all morning and sometimes into the later evening. This day in question, I got off work at around 4 p.m. The drive back to my house is roughly 45 minutes. Because of it still being in winter, it was still getting dark out earlier than it is now. I think sunset is roughly around 6 p.m., if I remember. I just know that it was dusk outside at the time, but still plenty of light and visibility. I live a ways out there, but not out in the sticks like some people do. I was on a long stretch of road that's not brimming full of houses and people, but there are houses spread out. It's a light traffic road, but not dead by any means on both sides. On both sides of the road are large fields of private land. There's nothing on them. No trees, nothing. Just large, empty fields backed up by trees and forests. I have no estimate for how many acres of field there are. Maybe 10 if I had to guess. I'm driving north on this road. No other car on the road in my range of visibility at the time. I was listening to the radio when my eye caught this large object moving in the tall grass to my right. I squint my eyes to try and see it better, and I start to make out this object, and it's actually a person. I'm getting closer and closer, and start to slow down to get a much better look. As I'm getting closer, I can see more vivid detail and understand that this was much larger than a person, even though the shape was like a person, but still walked upright like a person. It was huge. This is also when I noticed large canine-esque ears and large broad shoulders and a dog head. It was walking away from where I was looking, so I was seeing its backside through the grass. It was moving slowly, almost with a limp. It kind of slumped as it walked. It was very strange. It reminded me immediately of how zombies kind of stagger and limp slowly. Or maybe it was severely injured in some way. I don't know. I almost came to a standstill in my car, just trying to look out my window to watch it. It was far enough away that I don't think it could hear me, or my car, but I could tell that it was large. Whatever it was that had a dog-like head and walking upright, I'll never know what it was. It was walking towards the tree that were still hundreds of feet away, if not more. I eventually came to a standstill. For probably about 2 minutes, I sat there on the road, watching it, my car totally still with my foot on the brake, until it reached the trees and entered. I have never seen an animal like that before. Certainly not an animal that big. And I've never seen a bear before in my life, but I'm sure that bears don't walk upright, especially like that. It's like I was looking at the backside of a werewolf or something. I know that sounds strange, but that's the only way I know how to describe it. Some slumping injured werewolf limping off into the woods is what I thought about. Only thing is that it can't be, because werewolves don't exist. So what did I see? I was so amazed at what I saw. I was very lucky I had that time to sit and watch this thing. Had a car came up behind me, I probably would have just put my blinker on and let them pass me. No other cars came from the opposite direction either. I'm pretty sure I'm the only one that saw this thing. I tried to do some research, and after extensive encounter reading, this very well could have been a Dogman. Based on the size, this thing was huge, and the dog head, and I don't see any other options. My mind doesn't want to go there though, because we've been taught our whole lives that it isn't reality, and those things don't exist. I don't know. I haven't told any family or friends about this, so you're pretty much the first one. I just chalk this up to being some sort of unknown animal, but it could be a Dogman. I don't know. I'll never know for sure. Back years ago, when I was an adventure hound, I was hiking the various forests of the Southwest and Pacific Northwest. This sighting happened to me in Oregon, in the Mount Hood National Forest, back in 2009. I hope this isn't too alarming, because I know many friends of mine who are going to listen to this and freak because they live in Oregon, and frequently explore this same national forest. Oregon is a beautiful state, full of lush timberwoods and greenery everywhere, and varying degrees of temperate and moderate temperatures. If you haven't gotten the chance to visit the state, give it a chance. It's got a little bit of everything, from desert to thick forests. Besides the sighting, I've had nothing but great experiences in this state, with much wonderful people. The sighting itself was back in May of 2009, to be exact. I was hiking alone by myself on Mount Hood National Forest. Beautiful forest full of thick pine and timber for miles on end. It's incredibly peaceful. During this time, I had hiked off-trail for quite a few miles to do my own exploring. I can remember it very clearly. I was sitting down on a fallen tree, finishing up a ham sandwich to put some fuel back in my body. As I was getting up and getting out my canteen to drink, out of the clearing in front of me, down a small incline, a large buck burst out the trees and was in full sprint mode. Before I can even finish the thought in my head, wow, that buck is huge. The largest black wolf I could have ever imagined broke through the trees right where the buck had just emerged in full chase. This was the biggest wolf I'd ever seen, and it was very, very large. In fact, so much so that it was very unnatural. It looked to be the size of a miniature horse or something of that nature. Its face, even though I was easily 200 yards away, looked strange. I can't quite explain it, but it looked different. Not the same structured face a wolf would have. Its snout and overall facial bone structure were just different. It probably took a whole 3 seconds for this thing to pass by the entire clearing in front of me in chase of the buck into the trees. More than enough time to get plenty of detail. There weren't any trees blocking the sunlight from this clearing either. It was a beautiful sunny day in May, so I got full details on what this thing looked like. By far the creepiest and strangest thing I've ever seen in the woods, period. I work closely with a childhood buddy, and he confides in me greatly, so I know he's not bullshitting me when he tells me about this kind of stuff. He lives in a much more rural area than I do, and has many more longer stretches of roads to drive, especially during the evening time, because the back roads end up being much faster than getting stuck in rush hour traffic. In November, he had seen this big, tall, hairy wolf-looking thing come out of these huge bushes at the intersection of this road one evening. Didn't get a great look at it because it was primarily engulfed in shadows, but enough that he was still able to make out size and somewhat of a shape. Scared the shit out of him. Didn't see it again until around 3 weeks later, just after Thanksgiving. Told me he saw the same creature stepping into the tree line from a slope by the road. Said there was blood and tufts of hair where this thing had just been. He assumes it had eaten a deer or some other small animal, and that was where the blood and the fur were. Then, he saw the animal a third time in January, much closer to where his house is. Said he got out of his car and felt this terrible feeling deep in his gut, like something was horribly wrong. He instinctively looked out about 60 yards to his left, and behind a large oak tree was what he describes as a real-life werewolf, standing there in the flesh. It was much brighter out at this time of the day when it happened, so he could see a lot more details. He relayed to me that this was the exact same creature he had seen the months previous, but it said it was even more ugly and evil-looking than what he had thought. Told me this thing had glowing yellow eyes. Not bright, but just a subtle glow that seemed alien-like. Said it had a shorter snout, but could see this thing had huge sharp teeth and massive claws. This thing had a smirk on its face, but it was like a "I'm about to hurt you and enjoy it" kind of smirk. He fled for his house and locked every door and window. Now, just a couple of weeks ago, he believes this thing has been trying to get into his house. Because of the street light placement, light can still shine through his closed blinds, meaning if you were to stand in front of his closed window at night, you would be able to see your silhouette in full view from inside the house perfectly. Well, a few times now, he's felt that same ominous feeling, locked his house down and closed his windows and blinds. He said he's seen this thing walking around the outside of his house. He'll see its massive shape as it walks by and wiggles the door handle to see if they're unlocked. It will stand directly in front of the window and drag its claws down the glass. It's like it's trying to just terrorize him. He hasn't mentioned anything about it making a sound, and I haven't asked. He's not exactly sure what to do. It's become frequent lately, only showing up in the early morning and doing this to him. He feels like he's been marked ever since that first sighting, like this thing recognized the fact that he saw it, and now it's been occurring more and more. That's the only way he relays it to me. Oh, and I should let you know that all of our businesses are still open, even in the current quarantine, so that's how we've still been in physical communication. Now, personally, I don't believe he is seeing a werewolf, but I believe he is genuine in his emotion and fear. I know so very little when it comes to Dogman, so I can't say for sure that's what he's seeing either. But he puts a hard emphasis on the fact that it looks like a Hollywood werewolf, only massive. My father, very recently in the past months, had traveled back out to a spot only he knew about to hunt again during the season. During his hunting trips, he ran across his 3 old game cams that he set up years and years ago that he must have forgotten about. He stuck big old SD cards in there, and each card was full of footage and pictures. After going through his pictures, he had tons of pictures of deer, mountain lions, all sorts of animals, but the one thing that disturbed him was these 3 pictures he had on this tall, wolf-looking creature. After seeing the pictures myself, I will say it's pretty freaky looking. You can only see the top half of it in all 3, but because of the thick brush, the rest is kind of blocked out. These pictures dated back in July, a few years back, which would make sense why the foliage was so thick in the picture. It looked to be like the picture, which made sense. The animal, or whatever it was, had to have been at least 7 or 8 feet tall in comparison to where my father put the cam on the tree. It had teeth that looked to be far too big for its own mouth. Very hyena looking, actually. Like if you had crossbred the two, but very thick and matted fur, from what we could make out. Anyway, just thought you might find it interesting. There was nothing really of interest on the other 2 cams he retrieved, just on the one. I'm currently in search for the SD card with the pictures on it. My dad still has it and never deleted any of it, so I can try and get them for you. We'll be in touch. Thanks. My girlfriend and I decided one day last summer to go hiking at the closest trailhead near where she lived. At the time, this was up in northern Michigan. Both of us at the time knew nothing of the so-called Dogman, and weren't into such hoaxes or stories of animals like that. Now, her and I aren't so sure, and have both become much more receptive to these types of experiences that people claim to have had. My woman and I went up to the trailhead near where she lived. This would have been the Manistee River trailhead. It's like a mile loop or something. Actually, I think it's 10 miles, and we were going to try and do at least a couple miles and turn around again. This was in the afternoon. I don't know if the time of day is anywhere relevant, but it should help make the story a little more concise and clear. During this time, we were probably around a mile, maybe 2, into the entire trail. It was beautiful, since it was summertime outside. The surrounding forests and nature were just breathtaking, and it felt amazing to be out in the woods. As we started hiking further in, we both commented on how it was weird that we hadn't seen anyone else on the trail that day. We were literally the only ones. This trailhead is usually pretty well traversed in all seasons to my knowledge. It was a beautiful day out too, with near perfect weather. I don't know if we had been walking for maybe an hour or so, but I remember my girlfriend was the first to comment that the sounds of the birds and animals around us had gone completely silent. I'm talking pen-dropping quiet. It felt a little eerie, but we brushed it off and thought nothing of it as we went on our merry way. Not too long after that, maybe 15 minutes at most, is when we started to notice this feeling of dread. I didn't say anything, but my girlfriend started to say she didn't feel good, like something wasn't right. I had the same feeling in my gut. It felt like we shouldn't be there, like we were out of place, like something bad was about to happen. I slowed my pace and began looking around, searching all of my surroundings. Nothing. Nothing even looked out of place, and I didn't see anyone ready to jump out with an axe and get us. We continued on hiking, the feeling only intensifying. We kept a good view on our surroundings, and we never did see anything at this point. It's no wonder we kept on pursuing. It might sound incredibly dumb to have kept pushing forward, but we just thought our intuitions were off. Maybe another 10 minutes later, and we see this older gentleman coming towards us from the opposite direction. His pace is incredibly quick, and he looked very distressed. About 20 feet away from us, he signaled to us and asked us if we planned on continuing the trail loop. My woman and I shared confused glances as he quickly explained that there's a dogman further up on the trail stalking him, and he's leaving, and we should too. Before we could even respond, he's walking back the way we came, yelling to us nonsense, that he didn't think they were up this part of the trail and this part of the state, and we need to leave. We were just kind of confused and shocked at his reaction, thinking he was somewhat crazy. But was he? We had never heard of a dogman, had no idea at the time that this was something that to be afraid of, but we both had this ominous feeling in the pits of our stomach. That we could not deny. Something was going on. Maybe somebody was pulling a prank on us. We weren't sure. This was all weird at the time. I remember asking her, "What's a dogman?" since I wasn't a Michigan state native. What did he mean by this part of the state? We had stopped to question what we wanted to do. I decided right then and there that we were fine and we should push a little further before turning around for the day. I think we had made it a good 3 miles, might be more. It seemed at the time that my girlfriend didn't really want to push forward, but felt obligated because I wanted to. I tried my best to make her feel safe, that we would be fine with nothing bad happening. This is the part where my mind was drastically changed. We get to this part in the trail, and we start hearing this low rumbling noise. I stop in my tracks to try and listen to this sound that is now very audible with the silent forest around us. Within a second, I am fully able to process the sound and realize it's actually a low growl, coming from the trees to my right. Through the brush and off behind a tree, clear as day, was this German Shepherd-looking dog, only high up. Well, I should say at least the head was. Way past my head is staring down at me, growling and baring teeth. This head had to have been at least 8 or 9 feet off the ground. I'm 6'1", and I had to look up to look at this thing. It was this massive, massive dog head, the size of a lion's head easily, but I couldn't see the body. There was too much brush obstructing any view I had. I could see the head, and it was staring right at my girlfriend and I. We both take off sprinting back the way we came. This is where things got worse. I realized as we were running that not only were the woods still dead of any normal animals and sounds, and there were no other people on the trail, but the worst of all was that there were sounds coming on both sides of the trail, off in the brush. We began hearing crashing, breaking of branches. It sounded like multiple large animals were paralleling us on the trail, on both sides. This occurred almost the entire sprint, all the way back to the trailhead entrance, where we fled for our lives. Running back to the car was honestly such a blur looking back. I don't even know how we were able to run so much as we did. At some point down the trail, I stopped hearing all the crashing and brush breaking behind and beside. I was so pumped full of adrenaline, I don't think I fully registered that something, or multiples of something, were following us. Whatever they were had to have been huge, because they were making so much noise crashing through the trees and wilderness around us. We get back to the car, and we get the hell out of there, questioning each other and asking what happened. What was that all about? It seemed like all we had was fear and a never-ending list of questions. We asked each other about the older man that had said something about a dogman, but we didn't know anything about that at the time. Instead of being fearful, we tried to be as studious as possible, researching as much as we could and anything we could find of anything supposedly living in the wilderness of the state of Michigan. Things kept pointing back to something called a cryptid. It was in reference to a dogman, the same thing as the man on the trail had mentioned. After reading more about how they're very commonly seen up in Michigan, Wisconsin, etc., and what they look like, I truly believe we did see one of these things on that day. The description is almost to a T of what I saw. My girlfriend and I both now believe that there truly is something out there in the woods of Michigan. We're a lot more safe now when we go out, terrified of what we know is really existing, but still cautious, always checking around us and our surroundings. We haven't had to talk to anyone about this, including friends and family. For whatever reason, I guess, with all the supposed encounters, I'm surprised there isn't more talk around here about them. We honestly never knew they existed before this happened. I'm not a believer in anything that we can't see with our own eyes. I usually need substantial amounts of evidence if anyone is to make substantial claims. Rightfully so. This event that I'm going to relay to you, however, was a little unorthodox, so to speak. I've never been so creeped out by what I was told and what I saw. I kept it to myself to keep from inciting panic, but I have no idea what I believe it was. I do believe that it wasn't normal, and it was something different. Different meaning I'm not sure exactly. Let me preface with every September, my family has this big get-together at my uncle's property, which extends very far out in the middle of nowhere, basically. This is great because this big get-together is a huge end-of-the-summer barbecue. Lots of us drink, many eat tons and tons of food, and just good times to be had. Well, in this instance, everyone showed up to the barbecue early in the morning, and we had this massive cookout. Time to prep food, all that good stuff. Everything went great. Evening time, the kids are all around the property playing and having a great time. Everybody is eating food and having a good time. Some of the older boys are off in the woods in the far back side of my uncle's place. I was tasked with keeping tabs on them, making sure they weren't getting into trouble. My uncle has some old bear traps back there that are still very much active, poison, and some other semi-harmful things. But the boys are pretty smart and know the general area of where to stay and to not venture beyond. My uncle's woods are part of state game land, so you can get lost in them if you travel for miles on end. He loves it for hunting season. Gets a lot of deer, a lot of buck, gets a lot of turkeys as well in the spring. Anyway, so I'm sitting there chit-chatting with family for a little bit, halfway into my first paps, and the oldest of the boys, well, we'll call him Chuck for the story, pulls me to the side, and he's pale as white sheets. He looked nervous, petrified even. Something was bugging him. I grew immediate concern on his demeanor alone. He said he and his brothers and cousins left the woods and won't go back in. There's this really big shape that kept following them in the woods close by. His younger brother thought it might have been some really big person in a werewolf costume. I couldn't even process what he told me at first, just because it was so outlandish. I kinda laughed it off nervously. They must have been seeing things. I told him to just stay out of the woods for now, and to leave it be. He didn't say much. Now, Chuck is the oldest of the boys. I tasked him with watching out for his younger brothers when they went and played in the woods. Fast forward a little later, right before it got too dark. I had completely forgotten all about the supposed nonsense that had occurred earlier in the evening. The sun was still out, but starting to get dusky, so we thought it would be great to have a big campfire, where we sit around and drink and have fun. Well, stupid me offered to go haul a bunch of wood up from the far side of his back property, up to where he wanted the fire. My uncle has about 2 to 3 cords worth of wood in this small woodshed he has on the way back side of the property, out close to where the boys were playing earlier, actually. Remember though, at this time, I had totally forgotten all about what Chuck relayed to me, and any of that really. I go grab the wheelbarrow, and I'm making my way down to the small woodshed to fill up the wheelbarrow. It's a good 600 yards away from where we were cooking out at. I make my way to the shed, set the wheelbarrow down, and start to walk into the shed to retrieve some wood. As I do this, I'm hearing brush move around and dead bramble being stepped on. You know, that kind of crunch sound when you step on dead thorns? That's what I was hearing, like someone moving around in these trees just outside the shed. This made me curious because everybody at the barbecue was up by the house. My uncle gets quite a bit of deer and other small animals coming through here, so I just thought it was that and ignored it. I'm grabbing split pieces of wood and just hucking them into the wheelbarrow. The hair on my arms and neck really starts to stand up, almost as if my body is reacting to something. I stop and listen for a second. The birds are silent. Everything around me is quiet. I can faintly hear laughter and chatter up by the house coming down this way, echoing. But the wind is all about I could really hear. This was strange. I was grabbing the last bundle of wood to throw in, and now the feeling is so strong I can't ignore it anymore, even though it's only been a couple of moments since I arrived at the shed. I was being watched. I knew it. I knew the feeling. I don't know by who or what, but I could just sense it. My mind goes into the worst possible thing. A mountain lion. I'm being stalked by a mountain lion right now, just beyond the brush. I carefully grab the wheelbarrow, and while trying to be as quiet and fast as possible, start to move back in the general direction of the house. I'm not sure if it was my reaction, or just me worried about this mountain lion was going to jump out and get me, but I turned around and took a quick scan of my surroundings. I didn't want to leave totally vulnerable with my back to the shed and the sounds I was hearing. Directly behind me, just a few ways off in the trees, was where I was hearing the rustling just moments ago. There was this large black shape. I couldn't tell what it was immediately, but I saw these pointed dog ears that were high up, at least 8 feet if I had to guess. My brain, scrambling to decipher what exactly I was looking at, understands that this definitely is not a bear. These ears were very dog-like. The mass, or shape, was so big that it didn't really appear to be something standing on all fours, or anything like that, but rather crouching, I guess. It was way too big to be a mountain lion, and mountain lions don't crouch, not like this. My brain just couldn't register what it was, but every fiber of my being was screaming at me to haul ass back to the house now. I should clarify that I couldn't really see any vivid details of this thing because of the brush and trees, but I could see that there was a large shape watching me. Like I said, I also saw the tall ears. You know, I really don't have an explanation for it. Maybe it was some unknown animal. I guess you can take what I say with a grain of salt, but I don't know. The way my body reacted to the presence of this thing was odd. The way everything went quiet. It bugs me. It tells me something wasn't right. You always should trust your gut instinct. And my gut instinct had nothing good to say about what was watching me. I could feel it watching me. The whole thing just felt wrong. It felt off. I don't think it was any kind of animal I know, but no animal I know gives off feelings like that. The only reason anything would ever go so quiet like that is because there is an alpha predator nearby. But this thing was so big. Could it have been an alpha predator? It was easily the size of a bear, but wasn't a bear based on shape alone. That also doesn't quite explain the canine-like ears I saw. The only thing I could sum up all of this was that it wasn't normal. I don't know what it was, and I'm a firm believer in science, but this was just something I can't explain. Take it what you will. If you or someone you know has a story, encounter, or experience you would like to share with my viewers, please send it to my email at stories@whatlurksbeneath.com. Thank you. Was working at my construction site late into the night, getting some tools out of my truck when the most horrific roar came from the woods surrounding the site. A few of us on the night crew stopped, looked around, and then at each other and shrugged. We were spooked, but we had a job to do. We weren't going to let some silly noises stop us. We continued doing our night crew work and things went as normal for the next few hours. We actually forgot about the roar until we heard some banging and clanging out by our work trucks. Since I was the supervisor on shift, I thought a couple things. One of our crew members was banging around, destroying things, or could have needed help. Or two, somebody was trying to steal our shit. I paced on over to where my work truck is, and as I'm about 20 feet away from my truck, out pops this horrible looking face from behind the bed of the truck. I stopped in my tracks. This shape stood up to tower over the bed of the truck. It looked down into the bed and reached to pick up what looked to be a dead animal from the bed of the truck. If I had to guess, maybe a small deer, and then looked right back at me, turned around and walked off into the night. Had I just seen a werewolf in the living flesh? Those teeth and that face. I was stunned for a few moments, not sure what the hell just happened. I felt like I was living in a dream in that very moment. These kinds of things don't exist in reality. So what the hell did I just see? Its teeth really stuck out to me, no pun intended. It bothered me. Nothing should have that many teeth. It was like looking into the mouth of a shark. So many teeth, all razor bladed. I knew those teeth were meant to shred meat to pieces. After a moment, I slowly walked back to my workers where they were laughing at me, joking what all that banging was. I was pale as a ghost, and apparently because they were asking me why I was so white. Did I see a ghost? Did I get scared of working out at nighttime? I just ignored it and just told them to keep working and drop it. Since we were doing the night crew thing that night, we left when the morning crew arrived later that morning as the sun rose. As I made my way back to my truck to leave, there was light, so things were a little more visible. There were blood splatters all along the side of the back of my truck. That's when I finally put the pieces together and realized that whatever was standing behind my truck was banging the small dead deer it had against my truck. That's what the banging was. I don't know if it was doing that to kill the small deer or if it was doing it to get somebody's attention to draw them over to my truck for an ambush. Whatever it was gave me instant chills as I had memories, vivid memories of those damn teeth again and that thing that stood up behind my truck. I didn't want to think about it anymore. I just got in my truck, ignoring it, and got home and sprayed all the blood off with my hose. That particular job site I got called into to cover a supervisor who had been out scared the living hell out of me and scared me so bad I have had second thoughts about returning as a night shift supervisor. My wife and I used to live in southern Ohio for quite some time. My wife worked as a nurse and would be pulling all sorts of random shifts. Sometimes her schedule would call her to work from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m., while other times she would work from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. It was so sporadic and it really wore her down the few years she worked at that hospital. For those in question, they were extremely short-staffed during this time period, and she was willing to give her soul to her job, having just got out of med school and having need to build her career. I would try and call her on her breaks through the hospital line and check up on her. This was back in the early 90s, so we didn't have cell phones or anything like that. Everything was landlines. One night, she was returning home in the early morning hours. I can't give you an exact time because I believe my wife doesn't exactly remember. She knows it was after midnight, but before sunrise. She was driving back home when having to make a sharp bend in the road before pulling into another road that leads down to our house. As she made the sharp bend in the road, her headlight shone her something straight from the pits of hell. Crouching about 50 feet away from the road was this large, dark, brown shape that had a wolf-like appearance, but had a human-like physique. She said when her headlights hit this thing, it gave no eyeshine. Instead, she told me that this thing had coal-black eyes, and it was like they absorbed the light of the headlights of the car. Everything else lit up. Even the fur glistened in the shine of the light, but the eyes were a solid black. She was in hysterics and stayed that way until she pulled up into the house and ran in the house in a fray. It really terrified her seeing what she did that night. I knew for years afterward she had nightmares about that wolf face with the black eyes haunting her in her sleep. Terrified it would find her and come after her. We moved about 4 years later, but she never ended up seeing that same creature that night. I really have no choice but to believe her. I mean, my wife is a very on-point individual. She wouldn't just make up something like that. It still haunts me how she came in the house, trembling with fear and weeping. For a while, she wanted to see a psychiatrist about hallucinating, but she said it was real and she just didn't make it up. She had been working all sorts of shifts for a long time and possibly chalked it up to exhaustion, but even then, nothing. No matter what time of night or day she came home, she never saw it again. This was the first and last time she saw what she did. I enjoy hunting throughout the Michoud State Forest, located in Pennsylvania. There's many of us around here that enjoy a good bow hunt, and I am no exception. To give you a better layout of the state forest, this area is a higher elevated forest, full of white pine and oak trees all throughout with thicker flowers and brush. This was in 2003, and I've had several friends who've been hunting in and around this area for years. I've gotten warnings that because of the lush population of deer, there's a high amount of Bigfoot activity in certain areas. I was a Bigfoot believer before this happened to me, but I had no idea these wolf creatures existed. I didn't even think it was a possibility. I've gone hunting in this forest a few years prior to this event and never had anything strange occur, so I was confident and ready to get myself a nice trophy buck this year. I got up in the wee early hours before sunrise and made it out there with my bow. I remember the air being crisp and cool. The onset of fall was really setting in this particular year. I remember walking quite a ways and making it to one of my stands that I had set up in the area. This particular one I had perched quite high up in the tree, more so than normal. I climbed up and climbed in, pulled out my coffee flask and sat and waited. I don't know at what point that I noticed the silence, but I became aware after some time the woods had died. Nothing. You could hear a pin drop from a mile away. It felt eerie. I've been doing this for a while, and I've never had my skin crawl like it did in that moment. From what I would estimate to be about 300 plus yards away in the woods was a bunch of whimpering and howling. This was loud. It sounded distorted, not like you would expect if you heard a coyote or a wolf, both of which I've heard, and it didn't quite match these sounds. I was curious, and so I kept trying to look around for any movement or anything that I could possibly see. Still, nothing. The whimpering and howling had stopped, and I began to hear movement in the brush from a little ways away, coming in my direction. Light was just starting to break, and I could start to make out minimal details around me. Things were still dead silent other than this movement that began sounding closer and closer. It sounded heavy, and I wasn't sure if it was a deer coming my way or what, but I could make out that there were multiple of whatever animal was approaching my direction. I heard branches breaking to my left, and out stepped these three beings. Beings is what I'll call them because it wasn't an animal, and it for certain wasn't a human. These three beings walked in unison together on 2 feet, very tall. If I had to guess, well over 6 feet. Their fur was charcoal black and looked to be like they absorbed all the light in the area. Their eyes, all three of them had this horrible yellow glow to them as they slowly hunched over and walked slowly through the forest below, taking their time with each stride. I tried to stay quiet and not make a sound as I went into full-on panic mode. These monsters, whatever they were, gave off an incredibly evil vibe. If they wanted to climb up into my stand and devour me alive, they could have easily. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. Every step these things took You could feel it in the ground below. I could tell these creatures weighed a great deal of weight. It didn't surprise me with how much mass they carried around and how tall they were. One of them stopped only feet away from my stand. This thing started lifting up its head and sniffing the air. It sounded loud, like a big bear sniffing right outside somebody's tent. I pissed all over myself. I was so scared. I'm watching all of this transpire before my eyes. I'm very fortunate that my deer stand was up quite a ways in this tree, because had I been lower, it could have just reached up and pulled me out. This thing sniffed the air for a moment and did some sort of weird thing with its mouth. I can't even begin to describe the noise. It was like a clicking noise mixed with a guttural sigh. I don't know how to portray it accurately. It was communicating with the other two. The other two both stopped and looked up in my direction. I felt like I was going to have a heart attack in that moment. I don't think these things saw me, but they looked right up in my stand. One of those things must have signaled for the other two that there was a person up in that stand. I held onto my combat knife like it was my life, and I usually keep it strapped to my thigh, just praying my death would be swift and painless. But they just stood there, all three of them making these clicking, chattering, guttural noises for a moment, and then continued on westward. Once they were out of sight, I began crying. I was petrified. I had a hard time even convincing myself to move my body, and I needed to leave before those things got back. If I was caught on foot, I was for sure a dead man. I wasn't going to have that. I managed to work my body enough to climb down my stand, and I ran as fast as I could back to where I came and left. I should probably give a little more clarity on what I saw and how exactly long that it lasted. Because of the early morning hours with the sun just starting to break through, lighting conditions were poor at best. So a lot of what I saw were massive shapes and silhouettes, and those damn glowing yellow eyes. The shape was a massive body with a dog-like head and pointed ears on top. Reminded me of a wolf or a German shepherd face. I could make out a snout, but more specific details were hard to accurately point out. I watched the entire thing out of my peephole in the stand. As this thing stood below my stand, it did stick its snout up in the air to smell, and I think it smelt me, and then try to communicate to the others that I was there. Their chattering sounded as if they were arguing amongst themselves, but again, it was very brief. They kept the same pace and stride all the way to where they were no longer visible. The entire occurrence probably only lasted 3 to 5 minutes at most, but in the moment, it felt endless. It felt as if time itself had come to an utter stop. I didn't think I was going to make it out alive. That experience alone really ruined the outdoors and hunting for me for quite a while. I had a hard time returning to what I was passionate about, and it took a whole 6 years till I could muster the courage to approach the woods again to hunt. The first few times back, I didn't go alone either. I wasn't risking something like that happening again. I never did go back to the national forest and instead hunted with friends on other land or their own properties. I told some of my hunting buddies about what I went through. These same buddies who have had hairy run-ins with Bigfoot himself, and they were in disbelief at a pack of whatever I ran into was out there in the woods. I was asked if I think what I encountered was a family of Bigfoots, but it didn't behave the way you hear Bigfoots behaving. I don't think Bigfoots have snouts either, and don't have ears on the tops of their heads. The way these animals hunched over as if their front arms were longer than their back legs. I've never seen a squatch in my day, but my buddies who have had plenty of run-ins with them have told me a lot about them. I got a feeling that this was a family or group of whatever these were. I'm just glad I was able to survive and tell you my story. Boy, do I have a hell of a tale for you, what lurks beneath. I've never written this to somebody before, and I'm hoping you'll be receptive to my experience. I remember it vividly, clear as day, every detail, and so I'm going to lay it out for you, the nitty-gritty. 10 years ago, I had just turned 21, Well, almost. It would have been August of 2009. To celebrate, me and 3 friends of mine drove all the way out to Hiawatha National Forest and northern Michigan. We drove from Washington State. We wanted to make a road trip out of it with my buddy Nathan, who was with me. He had family up in northern Michigan. Our plan was to stop and see his family briefly, and then go party. I was also with my other buddy CJ and his girlfriend Ashley. We had packed everything up on a Friday and left for northern Michigan. We spent about 3 days in total to reach our destination at Nathan's aunt's and uncle's house. Between all the frequent food stops and bathroom breaks, we were pretty antsy from being in a car for so long and just wanted to get out and go celebrate. We had come to party, and that's exactly what we were set out to do. Before we left his family's house, we loaded up on some Jack Daniels and beer. I have had an interesting past with old Jack. Our plan was to head north, deep into the Hiawatha National Forest, and find a good spot just to hike miles in and set up camp. Or so that was the plan. We drove up quite a ways. If I remember accurately, we passed Mapleville, which is way up there in Wisconsin. If you head east of Highway 41, you'll reach this lone road called NF13 with deep woods on both sides of the road. This was where we were going to venture off and begin our celebration. Along NF13, there are several different pullouts. Well, I'm going to call them pullouts for this story, because they're not necessarily roads either. They're more like pathways with only vehicle marks on the ground to indicate that you can drive down there. We suspected there to be campers or whatnot in them since they were just unmarked, and we didn't want to invade anyone's privacy. So, we just pulled our car off to the right of the road and got all of our stuff out and ready to go. We got all of our backpacks on, and the camping equipment and beer, and we were going to head out with handfuls of stuff. There's no marked camping spots or campgrounds where we were headed. I was aware that there was a campground within 20 miles of us. I'm not sure whether south or north, but we wanted to just go and explore the woods, be more secluded. I knew there was a stream west of NF13, so we headed in that direction. We probably spent 2 or so hours pushing onward west through the thick woods. We had our backpacks, tents, and cases of beer. It took us hours with all the breaks we had to take to get and find the perfect spot. But once we found it, that was it. We quickly set up our camp and started blasting music through our iPod. We had brought little speakers that were battery powered that we started blaring Lil Wayne through. We were cracking beers and drinking Jack and going crazy. At this time, I don't know the exact time, but the sun was starting to set. It was in August, so I don't know, maybe 7? Either way, we had a ton of beer. I shotgunned so much beer that I vomited at one point. Ashley and CJ were having a great time, but sought to retreat to their tent multiple times for 15 minutes because they needed to talk in private. We all knew what they were doing, and they were pretty vocal about that. Well, Ashley was, at least. Anyway, that would just leave me and Nathan to pound more beers. This repeated until about 11 p.m. I remember that because I had left my phone in my backpack all day and wanted to see if I had any service at all and pulled it out. I didn't have service, but it was 11:02. I felt fairly drunk, but was not shit-faced. Nathan was so drunk, and I think CJ and Ashley were either having pillow talk or they had passed out at this point. So much for staying up late on my 21st, I thought. Nathan and I thought we would start to tone it down and just sat by the fire we made and bullshitted for maybe another hour or two before it was time to settle into our tent. Oh, I should expand on that. We brought 2 tents in total, one for me and Nathan to share and one for CJ and Ashley that they shared. They were across from one another with the fire in between us. Once in our tent, it didn't take us long to settle in our sleeping bags with a hearty, "Night, bro." And in my half-drunken stupor, I passed out. Next thing I know, I'm being shaken awake by Nathan. "Wake up! Wake up!" It took me a couple of seconds to come to, but now I'm pissed he's woken me up, so I snapped at him. He grabs me and says he thinks there's a bear outside of our tent. I shut up and I quietly listen intently, just like he is. Interestingly, the first thing I heard or didn't hear was the sound of the forest. It was August and the forest was alive and full of bugs and crickets all night during our drinking binge. Now it had fallen silent. I didn't hear a single sound. That was off. Then I started to hear heavy thuds, like from a heavy animal. Then I really started thinking there was a bear walking around our tent. It sounded big and I could tell it was close. Me and Nathan looked at each other and held our breath. We heard this thing get close to our tent and start sniffing. I really began to freak out, trying my best not to scream. I was terrified of bears, and I knew absolutely nothing about the temperament of bears, other than the fact that they can eat you. The sniffing continued, and then this animal seemed to totter off away from our tent. It started to huff and grunt like bears do. We heard it start to leave our tent, and can hear it still making noises. The noises began to trail off further and further. It started to get quiet, and I remember telling Nathan that we can relax. The bear was just strolling through and now it's gone. As soon as I finished that sentence, I hear this crazy animal squeal and roar like I had never heard in my life. Nathan and I's attention snapped over to the side of the tent, freaking out. We started hearing a bunch of roaring, growling, and commotion going on. It was hard to tell how far away it was. It was in the middle of the night and it was pitch black outside. It couldn't have been too far away. We knew it was somewhat close by. The roaring ceased after maybe 30 seconds. I could not exactly tell what the fuck we just heard. It sounded like a bear fighting off a dinosaur. It was the most frightening thing to listen to in the middle of the night in the pitch black darkness. Nathan and I are basically shitting bricks at this point, shaking when we hear CJ scream out in the distance. He sounded far away, but it was undeniably his voice. Nathan and I shot each other a panicked look, and I quickly and slowly and as quiet as I could unzipped the tent, just enough that I could see his and CJ's tent. The door flap was open. I turned back to Nathan and told him it was CJ. I slightly stuck my head out of the tent and yelled, but whispered at the same time, "Ashley, are you in there?" I heard her softly sobbing in the tent. She whispered up telling me she heard CJ scream too, and all of the commotion, but was too scared to get out of the tent. She didn't even know he had left the tent until she had awoken to all the commotion. The woods at this time were silent, and we weren't sure what to do. Nathan argued in whispers that we need to go out and look for him to make sure he's okay. And I started arguing back saying, "Did you hear what we just heard? I'm not going out there with what we heard." That's when we started to hear noises in the brush nearby. Then we started to hear the growling. It was extremely low. I remember the bass to it. It was demonic, and not all the same energy like the bear brought earlier. This was different entirely. The bear that we were certain was in our camp before was sniffing around and probably just curious. We could tell it was a bear, just alone due to its huffing sounds and breaths, and the thuds on the ground. There is just certain sounds bears make. I mean, it was unmistakable. This, though, was different. The footsteps sounded incredibly heavy, but heavy in a different way. It sounded like it was walking on two legs, not four different legs, and it sounded slow, like this animal was trying to be sly. The growling and humming it emitted were so evil. I don't know how to relay the emotion. Nathan and I turned white. We knew we were in grave danger. Something else besides a bear was outside of our tent. I was frozen in fear, but I knew I had to do something. I didn't have any weapons on me or near me. I had a pocket knife in my backpack somewhere, but that wasn't going to help me at all in this situation. Nathan pulls out this police-like flashlight, which I didn't even know he had, out of his sleeping bag and shines it outside the tent flap, looking around with a flashlight at whatever was around the camp. My heart dropped at his bravery in fear of him invoking whatever animal is out there, and that we're in here. He didn't care. He wanted to try and scare this animal off. He moved the light just right, and at some point, fully illuminated, right by this tree, the ugliest wolf, if you want to call it that we have ever seen. It was looking down at the ground and slowly lifted its head up to meet its gaze with Nathan's beam of light. It let out a nasty growl. It was pissed. I started crying. The size of this thing's claws and teeth alone were enough to do it right in that moment. But its size alone, and the fact that I was looking at a werewolf standing 30 feet away from our tent, really drove it home. Nathan quickly turned the flashlight off and zipped up our tent as fast as he could and dove back into his sleeping bag. I've never seen him so pale in my life. I thought he was going to puke. I was on the verge of having a mental breakdown, knowing that we just saw what we did and it was real. Now I'm stuck in this tent. CJ is gone and poor Ashley is left all alone in the nearby tent, unsure of her safety. We have no weapons and there's a goddamn werewolf walking around our tents. But things quieted down. We didn't hear anything. Not even the thudding of this thing's footfalls walking around now. That made us even more nervous. What if it was sneaking around now? What if it was employing stealth to try and get us? We had to stay awake. We could not fall asleep in case this thing tried to get us. This was the worst passing of time I've ever experienced in my life. We were probably in that tent for hours upon hours, just lying awake, constantly on high alert and aware of our surroundings, but couldn't move. We finally started to see daylight at some point, but didn't want to risk getting out of the tent until we had more visible light. We were so exhausted from the sheer adrenaline rush and the intensive amount of fear. None of us had really slept at all. If at any point during this experience I still had alcohol in my system, it had scared me stone cold sober. I guess I should have checked my phone for the time, but I didn't. It was summer, so it gets bright early, like 5 a.m., so maybe it was between then and 6. Nathan finally signaled for us to get out of the tent and just leave our shit. We were going to grab our essentials, but fuck the tents and the beer. We didn't want anything to do with being out this far in close contact with that freak of nature, freak of a monster out here. Once it was light enough, we got out of the tent. We could see enough that our camp had been thoroughly rummaged through. Whether it had been done by the bear or whatever it was we saw, we weren't quite sure. We ran over to Ashley and CJ's tent, and Ashley had been curled up in the fetal position asleep. We woke her up and told her we needed to go find CJ and get out now. She had fallen asleep from pure exhaustion. I don't blame her. We started to head back towards the way we came. Luckily, I know we weren't far from the vehicle, so we headed back in that direction. Now, this is where shit got really real for us. We're running back with just our backpacks towards where we believe we parked on NF13. We're yelling for CJ, but nothing, of course. There was a bloody trail, and we couldn't make out what it was, but if I had to guess, it looked like an animal had been killed and then dragged. It was dragged in the direction where we were heading, so we walked back in the early morning. These drag marks went alongside of us. Up on this little hill as we got to the top, there it was. Well, what was left of it at least. A large, or when it was alive, black bear. Its body was bloody, mangled, and crushed to a pulp with its guts ripped out and strewn across the ground. It looked like this thing had been crushed by a boulder. Nathan and I were speechless when we came across it, and Ashley gasped. She started crying, saying she just wanted to go home. I knew in that moment if we didn't get back to the car now and escape, we were going to be killed. I don't know what the hell is out there in the woods that can take down an adult-sized black bear, but I didn't want to mess with it. I was filled with fear and adrenaline again, and at one point back to the car, the thought that CJ might have been killed and eaten haunted me. We never found him. We did eventually make it back to the car by the miracle of God himself. It was still early in the morning and no sign of CJ still. Now, we're standing by the car, arguing whether to leave and go find help, or to go back in the woods and look for CJ. Ashley is just crying hysterically, while me and Nathan are continuously arguing about what to do, when we see this lone car in the distance head our way. Then we see the lights and immediately recognize that is a cop car. We turn and signal the car down, and the car stops in the road. The cop gets out and asks us if we were okay and what was going on. We explain to the officer our story of what happened, and he tells us that CJ is in the hospital. He made a beeline for the road last night after being attacked by some unknown animal, suffered deep wounds in his back and left arm. Something attacked him. Most likely a bear, the cop said, due to the claw size and the amount of sheer tissue damage and blood loss, but he almost bled out and was transported to the hospital. A different officer just happened to be driving by and found him waving on the road, bleeding like a stuck pig. This officer was sent here to come look for us. I guess CJ had mentioned he had 3 other friends, maybe a mile or 2 in the woods, that we needed help. The officer told us he would like to take our names and take our story down. He allowed us to drive to the hospital and meet up with CJ, and of course, he followed. We got to the hospital and CJ was sleeping, all bandaged up. The same officer really began asking questions, even though we told him exactly what happened. Even though CJ was all bloody, he began acting weird. I don't think he believed us. Turns out the PD actually thought we conspired to attack and kill CJ, and that the whole werewolf bear phenomena thing we experienced was just a clever cover-up to mask our failed attempt at murder. Things got a little crazy and we were brought in for questioning. Each of us, of course, but CJ's story once again had come to save us. He was able to tell that his story lined up with all of our other stories that we experienced. Detectives got to him before we did, so they were able to get his story first and foremost. He told them he had gotten up in the middle of the night to take a piss when he thought he heard a bear approaching. Then, he says he heard all of this crazy commotion, like 2 big animals fighting, and he fled off into the night, with only his phone light. Something ran after him. Something that looked like a wolf walking on 2 legs, and tried to grab him, but it didn't. It slashed his back and left arm pretty bad. He says the run from that to the road was a blur, and didn't even realize he was bleeding as much as he had. He literally had fat oozing out of his wounds, they were so deep. Absolute crazy shit that no one will ever tell you. So there it is, that's my story. I remember it vividly, like I said, and I'll carry it around with me forever, and I will never forget it. I still keep in contact with Nathan on Facebook and don't see much of CJ anymore. He took a coding job down in Western Virginia and obviously made a full recovery. I'll have to see if I can get him to send me a pic of his scars so I can show you. They're gnarly. Oh, and him and Ashley broke up a long time ago, so I haven't kept in contact with her in ages. But there you go. Believe it or not, I swear by the Bible and all that is holy that this is what happened to us, including the accusations that we somehow tried to murder CJ and that whole mess. I'm glad it's in my past where it thoroughly belongs.